On tonight's panel, we have lots of guests from Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland throughout the week, including on this programme, and we also have lots of callers, including our first caller, Marty in Belfast, is speaking for the whole of Northern Ireland on the programme. Hello, Marty.
Oh, no pressure then, Iain, eh?
Quite. Now, what's your question for the panel?
Why is everybody in power so narrow-minded about how to pay for social care?
Why do you say narrow-minded?
Well, they're either looking at just income tax or not. Well, according to the media, either income tax or national insurance. Surely to goodness, the government could create a social care fund, for want of a better expression, and link the contribution levels to the similar income brackets that they use for income tax. So non-taxpayers, who are obviously the least, don't pay anything. Basic rate taxpayers pay, I don't know, a 1% charge or a 2% charge, whatever it is. Higher rate taxpayers a little bit more. Additional rate taxpayers a bit more still. But it has to be separated. It has to be solely for social care.
Okay.
I mean,
right.
I'm no rocket science, but that seems simple to me.
Marty, thank you very much for that. Joe Harris, let me come to you first, because social care is a real problem for all sorts of councils up and down the country, and the proportion of the budgets that it takes up now, well, you tell me, I suspect it's far more than it was 10, 20 years ago. Why, I mean, to sum up Marty's question, it's really, why aren't we being more imaginative about how to fund social care? Why does it have to come from the traditional ways of funding things?
Yeah, well, I think it's because it's a politically a very toxic issue. If you remember back to the 2017 general election, it basically torpedoed Theresa May's election campaign, and then obviously it was put on the back burner. So we're waiting for the government to it's been put off to the autumn now, come up with their proposals. But yeah, it's a very, very complex issue. You've mentioned councils there. My own county council here in Gloucestershire frequently overspend on adult social care and indeed on children's social care. So yeah, it's a very complex issue, and it's a big politically toxic issue, and it's an easy one for the politicians to go at each other on.
How would you fund it?
That's a good question. I think we need to I think we need a big discussion. We've had several reports, haven't we, Dilmore? We've got the government presenting proposals in the autumn. I think we need to look at progressive taxation. I do. I think if we're going to pay for something, we need to ensure that the state is there we need to ensure the state is there to care for people. People pay taxes throughout their life. We also need to look at how individuals can pay for it, and this is where it went wrong for Theresa May a couple of years ago, because talking about, I think it was the dementia tax, wasn't it? I think it's a really tricky one, and I think we need to have a big open discussion. And I think where possible, it needs to be cross-party, because the only way we're going to come to a lasting and permanent solution on it is if we've got that cross-party consensus. But I don't see people clamouring to get round the table at a Westminster level.
Nav, what do you think about this? Because Joe says we need to have a big open discussion. We've kind of been having that discussion for more than 10 years now, haven't we? There were cross-party discussions, I think, certainly in the latter years of the Gordon Brown government, and I think in the early years of the coalition government. What would be your solution to this?
So yeah, I mean, this is a massive issue, and you're absolutely right that we've been talking about it for years and years, and not much has happened. If we were under a Labour government, we'd be working towards a National Care Service, which would be similar to National Health Service. Important to remember, Labour delivered National Health Service free at point of use for everyone. But yeah, I appreciate you asking about funding. So I would go back to a progressive funding model, but we've long been promised for years and years a white paper on social care reform, but we haven't seen that. Now, I understand obviously the pandemic has made things challenging, but it's long overdue. We live under a system where National Health Service has meant that people are living longer and longer, and that's a wonderful thing. That's a massive positive. But with that, of course, come challenges. And I'd personally like to see a National national care service similar to the NHS model, where everyone, regardless of their background, can access it. But of course, there's a huge cost element to this, and it needs to be funded by progressive tax system. People with the broadest shoulders, people with the deepest pockets need to pay a little bit more than people perhaps on minimum wage or 0-hour contracts.
So you can understand the logic of saying, well, look, it is a kind of insurance thing, isn't it, social care, because not everyone is going to need it, but many people will. So if it is, if people see it as an insurance-based thing, why not increase national insurance by whatever? They're talking about a 1% rise in national insurance. But of course, that would be quite regressive, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think looking at it from an insurance-based model is quite dangerous, because we have a system, if you look at America, some other countries in the world, where you pay a premium and then you access healthcare. And we know that people sometimes who have life-changing health conditions like cancer have to sell their property and live in a tent or be homeless in order to seek treatment. And I don't think we should be going down that route. The UK has a different system to the US, and we should be looking at funding it from state funds. But I do appreciate it comes with a huge price tag, and I understand people's sentiments where, someone on clearing a £10 million a year accessing free care system compared to someone who might be on £7 an hour. I get that, but we do have a similar system when it comes to the NHS. Now, unfortunately, we've had many deaths due to COVID, but it would have been much worse if we didn't have the National Health Service and the fantastic vaccine rollout. So it needs to be a similar model to the NHS.
Pauline, Latham, when you read the reports today of a possible announcement this week and it would be funded by national insurance, did your heart skip a beat, or did you think, oh my God, this might be politically disastrous?
Well, the trouble is the NHS is supposed to be funded by national insurance, and it isn't. It doesn't cover it. So much more funding goes into it. So there's only three ways you can deal with this. Either people pay, which isn't fair, or taxes rise, or national insurance rises. And no government likes hypothecated taxes, so that probably won't happen. Or if it does, will 1% really cover the whole of social care for this country? I would doubt it very much, because social care is incredibly expensive. So I do think it's something that we have been talking about for years. I remember going back nearly 20 years on Derby City Council having a presentation about this and talking about how it will be funded. So it's long overdue, and I don't often agree with Liberal Democrats, but I do think that it has to be cross-party. It's the only way it will work. We've got to look at it cross-party, because we can't have it being a political football. It's got to be agreed by everybody, and that's the only way we can do it. But NI, I'm not convinced that 1% would cover it. So it's you can put all sorts of numbers up in the air, but somewhere the money has to come, because we have to solve it, because there are people in a desperate situation that need care, particularly the elderly and with dementia now, which is a big problem. We've got to be able to fund those people and help look after them, because families find it very hard to do that.
Jonathan List, the advantage that you and I have on this panel is that we're not elected politicians, so we can say controversial things without fear of the electoral consequences of that. Shouldn't there be a much wider discussion here and say to people, look, I'm sorry, if you own a house that's worth £1 million, why do you think you should keep that house to give to your children when you should be using the money that you've accrued through the ownership of that house to pay for your own social care? Shouldn't we actually just confront that as an issue?
I think that is it's an important question to ask. I don't know the answer to that specific question, because obviously there are all kinds of issues about people who might be asset rich, for example, and not have other source of income. I think it should be something on the table. But I agree with Marty absolutely that we have to be a lot more imaginative. And I suppose that for most people, reading about this or hearing about it, they will just look at the enormous sums which were sort of dispensed by the government at the drop of a hat in the last 18 months. £37 billion for test and trace, billions and billions of pounds on Brexit, for heaven's sake, despite the amount of money that was meant to be saved by that.
Well done. It took you 2 minutes.
It's not a political point. It's about how the government can spend money on things it chooses to spend money on, when there's a perceived urgency. And this is clearly an urgent issue. It's something that is in the background, but that doesn't make it not urgent. And so the government, if it wanted to, it could access the same income streams, if you like, and borrowing streams to fund all that other stuff in the interim to plug a gap. And in the long term, think about long-term ideas, such as Joe mentioned, about having a specific tax, or, heaven forbid, a sovereign wealth fund with all the money that we've made through our natural resources over the years. There are all kinds of things we could do, which is not on the table.
Isn't it an incredibly lazy argument, though, to say that, well, we spent £400 billion on COVID, so what's another 6 billion? What's another 10 billion? What's another 20 billion? Because you could make that argument right across any policy that you care to mention.
Well, I mean, it's about prioritising, isn't it? Now, clearly, COVID is an extremely important issue, and the government has rightly spent money on it, not necessarily very effectively if we look at the state of test and trace. The point is that the government can spend money if it wants to. The reason that we're having this conversation is the government has chosen not to spend the money, and it's chosen to kick the can down the road for fear of being unpopular. And what I'm saying is that there are things it can do in the interim period to plug a gap. The idea behind the NHS, let's not forget, was from cradle to grave. Now, that is not what the NHS is at the moment. It kind of stops when you get to your mid-70s or 80s. Now, clearly...
Yeah, but don't forget, cradle to the grave originally was not as old as people are now. Cradle to grave went to about 55, 60, if you were lucky. I mean, you were very lucky to get beyond retirement age and enjoy a healthy retirement. So cradle to grave wasn't anywhere near as long as we are now.
No, that's entirely true, Pauline, but I suppose that the point is that the fundamental principle of the NHS is that people can rely on a safety net until they die without having to become impoverished in the process. I think that's a cross-party principle that we can all agree on.
I suppose the point that I was trying to make was that the NHS doesn't do that. Now, if you suffer from dementia, you don't get the level of care that you get if you are a cancer patient, for example. There are all sorts of anomalies in the care system. I'm not justifying it by any stretch of the imagination, but I could easily say, well, if we've got £5 billion to spend, should we not put that into dementia care, or should we not put that into something else? There are so many demands on the public purse at the moment, and there will be after COVID, obviously, that it's difficult to say that we can meet every single one of them.
But dementia does come under the umbrella of social care, and so I think that it's it's not going to be a piecemeal solution. There has to be a fundamental rethink, which will require bravery. And as someone was saying in the paper over the weekend, Johnson at the moment has such a huge majority. He has the power to force through some potentially unpopular policies. That doesn't necessarily make it a good thing, but he has the power to have a genuinely interesting conversation. And the fact he's not doing it at the moment, it seems that he just doesn't have.
Okay, let's go back to Marty. What do you make of what you've heard, Marty?
Again, Ian, the politicians, with the greatest of respect to them, they keep coming up with ideas that are incredibly complex. I think that part of the problem is they overthink it. I think it was Sheila's show yesterday, and I unreservedly apologise if it wasn't. But the polling shows that the vast majority of public are in favour of paying more for social care. But it has to be completely separated from general taxation. And I just don't understand
I'm not
why...
so sure about that.
You're not sure about what?
Ian, if I can, the big issue...
Okay,
yes.
Joe.
The big issue is money, but the other massive issue facing social care is staffing. I think it was the beginning of last year, the gap in social care staff was about 120,000 people. That is a real issue. And as we go into this brave new world outside the European Union, access to labour is going to be a real challenge. And trying to find people to work in our social care sector is the other big challenge as well.
Well, of course, it might help if they were paid more than the minimum wage and they actually had their travel costs covered rather than just being paid for the time that they are with the people that they care for, which I still think is just so grotesque.
Lots of unsafe staffing levels as well. I speak to people who work in care rooms all the time.
Absolutely. I wonder, just to finish this off, I wonder whether one solution might be to put up income tax at all levels for anyone over the age of 50 or 55. So you actually get older people paying for social care and not putting it on the younger generation. question. I just throw that out there. We can come back to that after 9 o'clock because we're going to be doing a phone-in on how to pay for social care after 9. Lots more questions to come. 0345 6060 973 if you have a question to put to our panel. It's 17 minutes past 8.
LBC.
Past 8 on LBC. You're listening to Cross Question, or hopefully watching us as well. Let me just remind you of who we have on the programme tonight. Nav Mishra is Labour MP for Stockport. I feel we've got to know him over the last 20 minutes, so we can call him Nav. He did give me permission. Pauline Latham is Conservative MP for Mid Derbyshire. I'm not going to call you Paul, if you don't mind, Pauline. I think that would be a bit too familiar. But Joe Harris, I can call Joe. He's LibDem leader of the Local Government Association. And Jonathan Liss is a political commentator. Our next question comes from Colette in Enfield. Hello, Colette.
Hello, Ian and Guess. I've had the advantage of just watching Dominic Cummings live, well, not live, recorded, with Laura Kuenssberg on the BBC. I watched him when he did his Rose Garden interview. The question is, who has been running the government for the last 16 months prior to his departure? Boris or Mr. Dominic Cummings?
Well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because if you believe Dominic Cummings, he was there but not really present because he had no influence at all, given what he's been saying. Obviously, you had the advantage of seeing that. Can't understand why you weren't watching the news hour, Colette, but there we go. I'll let that one go. Let's go to Pauline Latham. I don't know how closely you've worked with Dominic Cummings in the past, Pauline, but he's got an awful lot to say. What do you make of all the things that he's been saying to the Select Committee in this interview? Because it does give a pretty bad impression of what goes on in Downing Street.
Yes, I have to say I've never seen him, never mind met him, because he's one of those shadowy figures that not us backbenchers don't necessarily meet. But I think he obviously had some influence whilst he was there. But what he's doing now is trying to make money. He's lost his job in Downing Street and he needs to get an income. So I guess he's writing a book. I tend to ignore him and not listen to him at all because I think he's just a bitter bitter man.
Well,
who wishes he was still there.
Isn't that burying your head in the sand a bit? Because even if you think he's exaggerated a lot, and even if you think some of the things he says are wrong, there has to be some element of truth to some of the allegations that he's making, even if you don't believe all of them.
Well, I think you're probably right. There's some truth in some allegations, but which ones, who knows? Because, anybody who can go off to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight, who talks rubbish in that situation, who knows what rubbish he's talking in the other situations. And I don't ever watch him, to be honest. I think he's a dreadful person, and he's obviously not doing the Conservative Party any favours. But if you believe every word he says, you're wrong.
You say that, but did you come out in the aftermath of the Barnard Castle incident? Did you go on the radio and television and call for him to go?
No, I wasn't asked to. So I might have done if I'd been asked, but I wasn't asked.
In no interview were you asked. Well, some very poor interviewing. I hope I wasn't one of them.
But Boris Johnson stood by Mr. Cummings when that incident came out, and I think it says a lot about the Prime Minister and his judgment. Looking at the last sort of 16 to 18 months in Britain, in the UK, every single person has sacrificed so much, and these revelations by Boris Johnson, a few other people that have been around Boris Johnson, I think reveal that he isn't fit to govern this country. But
let's put the boot on the other foot. If this had been Keir Starmer and there were people around him that had got into trouble for whatever reason, and he immediately sacked them at the first sign of grape shot, that wouldn't say much about his political leadership.
Well, it wouldn't, but I think it's very important in a time of a global pandemic that the same rules apply to everyone.
So do I.
That if you work in a senior position in Downing Street, you shouldn't have different rules applied to you.
Well, no,
and if you put other people's life at risk,
everyone will agree with that. You're absolutely right. But I think it's an easy thing to say when you're in opposition. Of course, this minister should go, that advisor should go. But when you're in government, you have to make those similar tough decisions.
I totally appreciate that. I was elected in 2019, so unfortunately I haven't had the taste of being an MP on the government benches. I appreciate that. But look, unprecedented times, pandemic, and him going out knowing that perhaps himself, other members of his family might have been infected, and putting other people at risk, putting his family at risk, was reckless. But his judgment should have been
questioned. To answer the question, who do you think was really in control of the government, Cummings or Johnson? Because, of course, when Cummings was in Downing Street, the Labour Party thought he was the devil incarnate. And now he's dishing the dirt. You all think he's a rather good thing.
Well, no, I think people should be careful when they hear what Dominic Cummings has to say. But he was put in that position by Boris Johnson. He didn't put himself in that position. So obviously it says a lot about Boris Johnson's judgment. A person who has a history of not taking responsibility, leaving decisions to last minute, and unfortunately, tragically, some of the consequences of that has been that we're in a really messy situation where over 1 million people are being notified by the app. Yeah.
Jonathan Liss.
Well, coming back to what Pauline was saying, I find it extraordinary that there's so little curiosity on the Conservative benches about what is actually happening in power. We have a man who certainly I have never been a fan of, but everything he's saying right now, I'm inclined to believe the majority of it because it's incredibly believable what he's saying. He's not said anything.
In the European referendum, where you were on the opposite side to him and effectively on part of the opposite campaign, you would have called him a liar at that point. You would have said all the things that he was saying were totally untrue, and yet now you swallow it hook, line, and sinker. I'm not swallowing everything hook, line, and sinker, Ian. I'm saying that the things he is saying, on balance, I'm inclined to believe them because they sound extremely credible. The things that Boris Johnson's saying, he's showing text messages, for example. He's not, he does have evidence to substantiate what he's saying. He's not just plucking it out of thin air. If you were to make those accusations about Theresa May, for example, another, complete political opponent of mine, I would say this doesn't ring true. Theresa May does not sound like the kind of politician who would say, let the bodies pile high in their thousands, get COVID and live longer, it's only the over 80s.
Boris Johnson saying it, well, we're inclined to believe it because it ties in with everything we think we know about him. Here is a man who puts his political aspirations above people's lives, who doesn't really have any interest except his own self-advancement.
So to answer the question, who was really in control of the government?
It seems like this is the most terrifying thing, Ian, because the person who's in control for the last 18 months is the person in control now, and that's nobody. There is nobody in control of this country. This country is being run by a series of press releases, a series of U-turns that see what the Telegraph is having to say, what the focus groups are having to say, changing their mind after every single thing. There is no clear trajectory. There is no clear policy agenda. And that is how we've ended up with the highest death toll in Europe, with no conceivable plan, with opening up to freedom while cases are rising exponentially to the horror of the rest of the world. This is a government led by someone who doesn't care, and it shows.
I describe you as a political commentator. You're more of a political activist, aren't you?
Well, I'm a commentator who has an opinion, Ian. I mean, that's never been a secret.
Okay, Joe Harris.
Yeah, well, I think the whole sorry saga sort of highlights the circus that we've had over the last couple of years. I mean, it really does. I think it tells you a lot about Boris Johnson's decision making that he'd put Dominic Cummings anywhere near power, and to answer the question, I think it probably was Dominic Cummings in charge, and certainly in the run-up to Britain leaving the EU. You remember, noble figures, Dominic Grieve, people like that being booted out of the Conservative Party. I think it's fair to say that Dominic Cummings was in control of that, I've heard that from Conservative colleagues. So I think it probably was Dominic Cummings up to a point, and I think it probably got to a stage during the pandemic when they realised actually this man is not appropriate to be anywhere near the reins of power, particularly during a pandemic. So yeah, as Jonathan said, though, it's a complete no. It doesn't feel like anybody's in control, and really, it's the country that's suffering.
But when you listen to his evidence to the Select Committee, as I say, I don't know what he said in this interview tonight, it was almost as if he was in the room but not having any influence at all, according to his evidence. That there's something there that doesn't quite stack up, don't you think, Joe?
Yeah, it's bizarre, but as I said, it just sort of highlights the circus that we've had over the last 18 months, 2 years. I think really we need to stop listening to Dominic Cummings. I really think the best solution for everybody is to just let him go away and fade into obscurity. I really do think the best thing for the country is for that to happen. But I do think he's making points which really back up what many of us thought about Boris Johnson anyway.
And there's been a lot of criticisms of the pandemic, which I understand, but nobody in this country has ever dealt with a pandemic before. So you can be critical of the government. And yes, they've made mistakes, but my goodness, they've done incredibly well on the vaccines, and nobody can deny that. And now we are getting so that we're more vaccinated than any other country in the world.
Colette, Colette, let's come back to you.
Last point, I don't think that we can use the vaccination programme, the success of it, as a paneer to say we've done exceptionally well. I think we've done exceptionally badly. However, when Dominic Cummings did his Rose Garden, I wondered who was in charge. After tonight, I actually know who was in charge, and I think it was Dominic Cummings. And tonight was a character assassination of the Prime Minister. I think it's scary because I don't know who's running the government.
Well, if it isn't the Prime Minister, who would it be?
Michael Gove? The question.
Is it Carrie Symonds? Is it? Who is it? Who is it? That's a very good question.
Oh, you're not going to descend into that Lady Macbeth stuff, are you, Joe? I'd expect better from a Liberal Democrat.
No, of course not. But it is it just goes. It begs the question, doesn't it? The whole circus, as I described it. Who is in charge? If you remember when Dominic Cummings was dismissed, it seemed to be an argument between figures in Downing Street, and it's just a distraction from the issues like social care, like we spoke of earlier. I just think we really need to focus on the issues rather than talking about all of the...
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question. It's 8:32.
support anyone who has to stay at home in England. It comes after the Business Minister Paul Scully suggested people had a choice. More than 1 million children were off school because of coronavirus last week. The figure, which represents about 1 in 7 state school pupils in England, is the highest recorded since classrooms reopened in March. And new Brexit tensions have emerged between the EU and the UK over border arrangements for Gibraltar. The territory wasn't included within the trade agreement brokered last year, and a separate deal must be agreed. And the weather, thunderstorms possible over the east of England this evening, but they will die away. Low cloud in northern England and Scotland, a low of 10 degrees.
LBC. This
at all times, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. From the 25th of October, it's expanding from central London up to but not including the north and south circular roads to help clean up London's air. So if you drive an older polluting vehicle, you could be affected. Make sure you're ready. Search ULEZ expansion and check your vehicle. To the Mayor of London and TfL, every journey matters.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
With Purple Bricks. Meet your local property expert today.
8:35 on LBC. Our panel, Nav Mishra, who's Labour MP for Stockport, Pauline Latham, Conservative MP for Mid Derbyshire, Jonathan Liss. Is Buxton in your constituency, Pauline?
No, it's not. It's much further north. It's called Mid Derbyshire, but it's nowhere near the middle.
I was up there for the Buxton Festival a couple of weeks ago. I've never been there before. What a beautiful part of
SK
the world.
postcode, Stockport.
So it's near you. That's what you're saying. I should have gone further.
45
to
minutes.
Okay, I'll know next time.
I'm Belper.
Okay. Jonathan Liss is a political commentator, and Joe Harris is LibDem leader on the Local Government Association. Joe, just explain a moment what that actually entails, what the Local Government Association is and what you do on it.
Yeah, so what's the best way to describe the LGA? Well, it's a bit like a union or the professional association of local councils. So the membership
sounds fascinating.
Yeah, well, Iain, you're always welcome. Ian,
you also lead
just around the corner from you, so you're always welcome to pop in. And
I know it is. You're also a leader of a district council in Gloucestershire, aren't you?
That's right, Cotswold District Council. It's a very nice place to come and visit the Cotswolds, I'm sure you know.
I'm actually coming to speak at a literary festival there next year, so maybe see you there. Right, let's go to another caller. It's Gareth, who's in Braintree in my home county of Essex. Hello, Gareth.
Hi there.
Hello, what would you like to ask?
Sure. So I'm a first-time caller, so you may have to forgive me if I stumble. My question is, do you think it would make sense if all public sector pay, including MPs, is linked so all receive a pay rise at the same time, at the same level, while allowing for one-off bonuses in sectors in extreme circumstances, aka a pandemic?
Should all public sector workers receive the same pay rise? Well, that's a difficult one, isn't it?
I'd like to see NHS workers get far more than 1%. It's all well and good, most people standing on the doorstep clapping, but then the government's delivered a 1% pay rise. I think that's unacceptable. The point about salary for MPs, I'm not going to deny that MPs are very well paid, and I think a lot of people who work in social care, the topic we were talking about earlier, a lot of people who work in the National Health Service. I know people in my constituency who work in the NHS on £9 an hour.
But would it be fair to pay all public sector workers the same pay rise, regardless of performance, regardless of what they do?
I think the pay rise should be negotiated by representative bodies. Of course, I'm a Labour MP, a Labour representative, and I'm unapologetically pro-trade unions. So I'd like to see representative bodies, the trade unions, we have independent trade unions in the UK, I'd like to see them negotiate a pay rise for their sector.
They do.
Yeah. Well, I think the 1% negotiation, none of the trade unions are happy with that figure.
Well,
Pauline.
The figure we're told, you're a little bit out of date on that. I think the figure is apparently going to be 3%.
Well, we will see when that happens. I still think 3% is not enough. My personal view is 3% is not enough. Look, I think some of the trade unions are talking about 15%, and I think they should, the government should sit down with them and come up with a reasonable pay offer, because we've seen public sector pay restraint for a long, long time. So in real terms, actually, a lot of these people who are hourly paid are actually worse off than they were many years ago.
People probably deserve a 15% pay rise, but you're not seriously suggesting to me that...
Well, I personally wouldn't be opposed to National Health Service workers. Some of them, are hourly paid, very low paid, get that. I wouldn't be opposed to that. That's my
Pauline Latham, you and I are from the same generation. I think I can say without fear of contradiction. You and I remember...
No, I would contradict. You're a bit younger. In fact, a lot younger.
That's very kind of you. Well, you will remember even better than I remember then the late 1970s, when we had lots of wage inflation because there were 15, 20% pay rises. Yeah. Now, they say politics is cyclical and everything sort of comes around every 30 or 40 years. Are we really going to go back to that days? But also do answer the question about, do you think should all public sector workers receive the same pay rises?
Well, that might be simple, but I don't think the unions will give up the power that they have now. So I don't think it's ever going to happen. And things are linked, and we do get similar pay rises for different public sector workers. But all those years ago, the late 70s, it wasn't just pay rises that went up that made everything... inflation go through the roof. It was rates, it was because it was rates in those days, not council tax. It was a huge amount of funding that was going absolutely bananas. And I mean, we were relatively young family at that time, and we just moved into a new house, and we couldn't really afford to stay there because we could before all that happened, and then suddenly everything went through the roof and it was incredibly expensive for everybody. And I think that would mitigate for the youngest people in this country who are just on the housing ladder. They would find it incredibly difficult to cope with that again, and I certainly wouldn't recommend that ever happening again, because it's crippling for younger people, particularly younger people.
Now, Joe, you presumably are the only member of this panel that has to handle public sector pay rises in your position on the LGA and presumably also on your local council. So what's your view of Gareth's question? Should all public sector workers receive the same pay rise?
Well, it would certainly make it easier. It would probably be a lot more expensive, though, and probably cause all sorts of problems, knock-on problems. Yeah, I mean, you're right. We have the issue every year. The pay reward for this year is still being negotiated. So we're a few months into the financial year and still haven't reached agreement. So. We'll have to backdate that, and that will cost us money, and it makes it very hard to plan as a council financially when you're months into your budgetary year and you still don't know what the award is going to be. I think we've budgeted for 1%, could be a bit more. We don't know. I think it's a really tricky issue, though. I think what we need to try and do is try and link pay rises in the public sector to cost of living. I think that's the real issue at hand here. in areas like the Cotswolds here, where I am, or even in London, the cost of living is extortionate. And yes, I'd like to give all public sector workers in my area a pay rise because they can't afford to live here in the first place. So it's a really big issue. In answer to the original question, I think probably not. I just think the practicalities of that, are concerning, particularly when we think about the economic storm, which is probably coming in the next few years. I think you look at the amount of debt we're racking up as a country, and everything off the back of COVID. It's going to be quite a stormy time, I think, over the next decade and into the 2030s even.
Jonathan.
Well, I think that's a very important point that Joe just raised about cost of living, which is obviously much higher in places like London where we are now. And so I think that public sector workers are also already paid a little bit more in London in some cases, but still that has to reflect the cost of living. In answer to the question by Gareth, I don't think that everyone should receive the same pay rise, the same reason that Nav just gave, which is the NHS. Now, obviously, I would want to see Labour actually being a lot bolder on this. When Starmer was going against a 1% pay rise, I think he said 2% or something like that. Like, it has to be far, far bolder. We need to recognise the extraordinary sacrifices that people have made in this pandemic. And I think that goes beyond the NHS as well, actually. I think we've had a problem for too long in this country where we divide people between skilled and unskilled workers. And what we saw over the last 18 months was that it was the so-called unskilled workers who were putting themselves in harm's way day in, day out to stock supermarket shelves, to man checkout tills, to collect our household refuse, whatever it may be, working in a post office and a shop. All that kind of stuff, the work that has for so long been sort of denigrated and dismissed by people in power, undervalued, exactly. And those people deserve, they put themselves in. A lot of them actually died through COVID.
Bus drivers, cleaners on the transport network.
Absolutely. And so I think there does have to be that we do have to have a different way of looking at this.
Well, you see, that's a really good point that you just made there, and I bang on about this all the time. That bus drivers' average salary is $25,000 a year. Tube drivers, $60,000 a year. Now you tell me that a tube driver who's essentially, and sorry to all tube drivers who are listening, but who's pressing a few buttons and pulling a lever, compared to a bus driver, I'm sorry,
Ian,
I know which one I'd pay more.
Ian, with the greatest of respect, it's about pushing everyone up, not dragging tube drivers down.
No.
So I hope you'll accept that. But look,
can I make clear, I'm not suggesting that tube drivers...
I know you're not.
You literally just said pushing a few buttons.
Yeah, the point I would make, Ian, is look, people who clean our transport network, people who clean our offices, people who clean our hospitals, they are paid often, rock bottom minimum wage. And in pandemic times, we're going out of our way to thank our key workers. Of course, NHS workers are very important, but also cleaners, bus drivers, people who deliver our groceries, people who deliver our takeaways, people who make that food. A lot of them work in the so-called shadow economy. We need to support them, respect them. How can we expect people to live, buy a house or rent a place if they are paid such low wages they can barely survive?
Well, if you can't build up capital as a young person, as I was able to when I was a young person, how can you expect people to support capitalism? That's the challenge, I think, for governments of all shapes.
You may have answered your own question there,
well, Ian. People should join the Labour Party, democratic socialist movement.
You just made the case of revolution, haven't you? Just live on LBC.
Did I? Well,
Ian, you're doing a great job.
I think I'm losing control. Martin has a sly dig at me here. He says NHS workers should get paid way more than a radio host who works 3 hours a day, 5 days actually 4 days a week in my case. But can I tell you, Martin, I don't just sort of rock up here at 7 o'clock and present this programme. There is a little bit of preparation that goes into it.
Ian, as I said, it's about lifting everyone up, not pulling down radio presenters.
I should say I'm going to be working Saturday and Sunday this week, and no double bubble, Nav, if I may say so. In for Matt Fry on Saturday, Tom Swarbrick on Sunday morning. Just thought I'd get that in. It's 8:46.
This is LBC.
Nav Mishra, Pauline Latham, Jonathan Liss and Joe Harris. I nearly said Joe Haynes then. Joe, you probably don't even remember who Joe Haynes is. He's press secretary to Harold Wilson and lives near me in Tunbridge Wells. You don't look quite as ancient as he is, but there we are. Best wishes to him if he's listening. He's a great man. Right, let's go to Janine in Glasgow for a text. Is it fair for those that aren't double jabbed to be excluded from society? Jonathan.
Well, if you think that a nightclub is society, then it's kind of a fun society in some ways. But no, it's not fair to exclude double jab people from society. It is fair, on balance, to exclude them from potential super spreading events such as nightclubs if everyone has been offered the chance to be doubly vaccinated. Now, this is a really difficult issue. I think that you do have to balance all kinds of things. There are some people who won't have the vaccination for a variety of reasons, but fundamentally, we are still in a pandemic. We are now in a third wave, which is getting worse every day and is likely to do so for the next month at least. And although it's closing the stable door after the horse has bolted to apply this measure at the end of September, it simply illustrates the fact that we should have, if you're only going to be able to do it at the end of September, then that's when you should be opening the nightclubs, for heaven's sake. But in that situation, right, but in that situation, I do think that it's a reasonable measure. And the fundamental thing here is that we shouldn't be doing this right now anyway, frankly. The Prime Minister made the point himself inadvertently yesterday when he said that 35% of 18 to 30s were unvaccinated. Well, those are people who are going to be going to nightclubs. So what does he think is going to happen to long COVID? Well, what does he think is going to happen?
Some people think that this move is a sort of a way of persuading 18 to 24-year-olds to get vaccinated.
And I think that's reasonable, and it's something that has been done in other countries. France and Italy are applying similar measures. I believe that you can't force people to get vaccinated, but you can say you need a vaccination on balance to go to this thing in the same way that they're going to be asking care workers to have vaccinations, because fundamentally, if you have the conflict between personal liberty and individual choice and public health has to come first, because my freedom cannot impinge on someone else's freedom. That's not what freedom is.
So you have no philosophical opposition to COVID passports in general?
I have questions about them. I think that it would be ludicrous for one person to wholeheartedly endorse one side or the other. It's a measure which is unknown in this country. I mean, obviously, we've all had immunisation records from when we were children, and anyone who's been to certain countries in the world will have had to have a vaccination in order to go there. So this is not entirely new, but certainly it's new in order to enable people to access certain leisure facilities and public and services. But it's not stopping people from going to hospitals or shops. That I would completely disagree with. But going to a nightclub is something specific.
Okay. Leisure venue.
Joe Harris, the Lib Dems have come out and said that they would oppose COVID passports if there's legislation. What's your view?
Yeah, well, I think it's a funny one, isn't it, when you've got senior members, of all political parties talking about the so-called Freedom Day, and then COVID passports are suddenly implemented. It doesn't feel very free to me. I think civil liberties quite often, aren't particularly popular, particularly in times of, security crisis, or as we've seen during a global health pandemic. But the concern with civil liberties always is that once you take them away, you very rarely get them back. And I think what we need to do is we need to ensure that the measures that we take over the next few months, and as we head out of the pandemic, touch wood, that's sooner rather than later, we need to make sure that they're proportionate to what we're doing. And I think going back to the original question, no, it's not acceptable that that double jab, that people that aren't double jabbed should be excluded from society. But as Jonathan has said, yes, if we're going to a large event, I think there's a realistic expectation that you might not be allowed to go. As you say, when you start getting into the realms though of banning people from the supermarket or banning people from the other public places, that's when you're in tricky water. So I think we need to tread carefully. I think if I was an MP, on balance, I would probably vote against COVID passports, just really for the civil liberties argument. But yeah, I think there are no easy answers on this.
Okay, Pauline.
I have to say, before I answer the question, I'm not really as red as this. It's just the sunset coming through the window, shining on me.
I thought it was just a good tan.
No, I don't go out in the sun very much. I think it's a really difficult situation because clearly the cases are rising and the deaths are going up slightly, but not anywhere near where we were before. I think it should be a personal choice. If people are worried about getting COVID or long COVID, but young people generally don't have a hugely difficult illness. There obviously are some exceptions to that. I think they've got the choice to go or not to go. I am uncomfortable. Again, as I say, I don't often agree with Liberal Democrats, but I do agree with once you've given up the freedom.
New coalition being built here.
I hope not.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that'll happen for a long time. But if you've given up your freedoms, then it's really difficult to get them back. And I'm very uncomfortable about this. I can understand it in some ways, but I just feel people should be allowed to make some choices.
Okay.
We've got through this and we aren't doing too badly.
Now, 30 seconds if I can, because I want to fit in another call.
I oppose these passports, but we need to make sure that the government keeps testing free of cost. We're not charging for tests. Venues will appreciate that. We need to have a quick turnaround on PCR tests and all of that. It's entirely up to people. No one should be forced to take the vaccine. However, I do think people should be encouraged to take the vaccine. It's safe, it's been tested, and the NHS has done a brilliant job rolling it out. I don't want to attribute the success of the vaccine rollout to the government, because the NHS has done a fantastic job. People should be encouraged to take it. They shouldn't be forced. Although, going back to Jonathan's point, it is not mandatory to go to a nightclub. It is not mandatory to go to a gig or anything like that, a so-called super spreader event. It is your choice if you want to go. However, of course, there'll be lots of people there, and if you're not double jabbed, then perhaps you may be carrying the virus.
We did nightclub experiences on last night's show, so I won't ask you all about that. But we've got time for one more question from Danny in Malaga in Spain. Danny, hello.
Hi, Ian. How are you doing? Hi to the panel. A quick question. What are your views on changing the rules on medicinal cannabis being used by the NHS? Because the rules are in place for it to be allowed, but it doesn't seem to be happening. People are finding it very difficult to access medicinal cannabis, like for epilepsy for children and so on. What are your views on freeing up the laws and just making it easier for medicinal cannabis to be used in the UK?
Your views... OK, thank you, Danny. Your views in 45 seconds each, if I can. Pauline, let's start with you.
I think my colleague Heather Wheeler in South Derbyshire has got the government to say that this will happen, but it needs some research into it and some science behind it.
Joe?
I think we should introduce a legal regulated market. Let's take this out of the hands of criminals.
This is This is medicinal cannabis.
My apology. So medicinal, yes, medicinal. Absolutely. I think, of course, it should be. Of course, it should be legalised. If you've got somebody who's suffering and there is clear evidence to suggest that medicinal cannabis can help, then I think, absolutely. So there you go. You got 2 for 1 there.
But the laws are actually already in place, but there seems to be some reluctance on the part of GPs to prescribe it. Nav, what's your view?
Look, the United States, several states in the United States, several nations in Europe have a much better system, and I think we need to move towards that. Of course, you've made the distinction between medicinal cannabis and cannabis for leisure, so it's very important. And as a constituency MP, I get lots of emails and letters on this issue, people who are struggling to get access for their children or for their family members. So it is a serious issue, and I think there's more and more research on the subject, and it should be more widely available. That's my view.
Jonathan?
I think it's a total scandal, the fact that we have seriously ill children who are suffering for no reason at all other than bureaucracy. It's that we've had endless research on medicinal cannabis. We know it's more dangerous for children to be sick than to have this. And there have even been stories about the drugs being held up from the Netherlands over sort of customs and ridiculous stuff like this. But the fundamental broader issue is that we need to have a market for all drugs. I don't believe in any criminalisation of drugs, and particularly when people need it to prolong their lives. It's just so stupid that we're having this conversation.
Danny, thank you very much for that question. Final text from Dean in Durham. Jeff Bezos from Amazon has joined Richard Branson by rocketing to space, sort of. Who would you like to stick on a rocket into space? Nav.
Boris Johnson.
Jonathan.
I mean, it's got to be him, hasn't it? I mean, who else could it possibly be? He's making all our lives a misery.
Joe.
Yeah, Boris.
Well, I think, Pauline, you're going to sort of probably disagree with this, or not?
Yes, I think I am. I'm going to say Dominic Cummings.
Well, some very unoriginal answers there, I'm afraid. I think you've let yourselves down, you've let the programme down, you've let your country down. Joe Harris, Pauline
Just
Latham,
like Boris Johnson.
Nav Mishra and Jonathan Liss, thank you very much. We're going to continue the discussion in a moment on how we should pay for social care. Looking forward to getting your views. 0345 6060 973. And for once, we've finished on time. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Labour has accused the government of mixed messages.